Live from Sydney, the ABC's Lateline. Here's Kerry O'Brien.
Welcome to Lateline, a program that promises something new in Australian television.
Good evening, welcome to Lateline. I'm Maxine McHugh.
I'm Virginia Trioli.
I'm Ali Moore.
I'm Lee Sales.
I'm Tony Jones.
And I'm Emma Alberici. Welcome to the final episode of Lateline. I've been sitting in the presenter's chair for the past 6 years, but the show's been a staple in the ABC's evening schedule for just shy of 3 decades. I've invited some friends to join me tonight to pay tribute to the important journalism that's been a hallmark of the Lateline brand. Welcome to you all, Maxine McHugh, Kerry O'Brien, Lee Sales. Welcome, and apologies from Tony Jones, who is out of the country. What do you call a collective of presenters?
An ego of presenters?
No. Ego is not collective.
We're already off.
That's a contradiction in terms.
A small herd.
Kerry, you introduced this program in 1990 by promising viewers something different. What do you think made Lateline unique back then?
Well, apart from the fact that there'd been nothing like it on Australian television before, and there were several reasons or several factors involved in that. One was simply the way we used satellites to travel the world and trawl the best people, the best minds around the world who surprisingly were prepared to be available to speak to people on the other side of the world. But also because the ABC was prepared to invest the time in conversation. We were not defensive about talking head television, where a lot of people were and are still. This thought that you can't grab and sustain an audience unless you've got constant movement and you're constantly distracting them from one thing to another because oh my goodness, we can't possibly keep their minds concentrated on one thing for any length of time. So that was another element. But the fact that we had the freedom to choose between hard-edged programs, strong social programs, philosophical programs, and even sometimes have a little bit of fun. And the audience came with us, and they loved it too. And people were hooked because they were hungry for knowledge. They were hungry for intelligent conversation that explored the world.
And Emma, could I just add to that? I think what happened very, very quickly is that the word went out that Lateline was the go-to program for serious commentary. And throughout the 90s, if I look back on the 90s now, and I think actually compared with today, it was a period of hope and optimism. Certainly, you know, after we got through the recession we had to have and all the rest of it, you think internationally, you know, the wall had come down, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of apartheid. This was a hopeful moment in multilateral relations. There was the idea, if you had something serious to say, Lateline was the place to go to, because it had a precious thing that few other programs had. It had time. There was time for proper research, there was time for reflection, and time for serious discourse. The 90s nationally, I think, was the decade, you could say, of Keating and Howard. Both of them conviction politicians, both very, very different, but both prepared to argue their corner. And of course, they did that over and over on Lateline, didn't they?
Can I just hold you up there? Sorry to interrupt you, Kerry, but we will actually get to the debate around the way the media landscape's changed a little later. I want to stay with those early years first off and talk specifically about some of the stories that were the hallmark of that era. And, Kerry, I guess the coup attempt against Gorbachev and Yeltsin stands out in those early years as one of the most memorable that you were involved in. Can you take us back to that night?
Well, we had one of the hardline plotters against Gorbachev and Yeltsin on the program from Moscow, a guy named Viktor Elksnis, who was the head of a very powerful bloc of hardline conservatives called Soyuz in the Supreme Soviet, and he said on the program, if Gorbachev does not come back to us, there will be a coup within the next few months. And this is what you're alluding to. We're back in Australia come August. Gorbachev is in his dacha on the dacha, however you pronounce it, on the Crimean coast, and suddenly there's a coup attempt. And we were on air as the old guard generals were in their cars driving to Moscow airport to fly down to the Crimea. It was their second attempt, actually. They were going back to Gorbachev to say, well, crunch point, come back and join us and sign the declaration of a state of emergency or your resignation. And he did neither. And at the same time, Yeltsin's in the parliament, the White House of Moscow, surrounded by tanks and about 10,000 people, which is not a lot. It's not a very big ring of protection. And in the old days, they'd have just been ploughed under. But because by then the world and a lot of citizens of Russia had got used to the idea of democracy, the old guard melted, the coup was over. And I think that because we were in the satellite age and the world was covering this as it was happening, and the pressure of world opinion coming back in on them was a part of deciding that outcome.
Extraordinary in the early days when we hadn't established ourselves yet.
Well, we were getting great talent right from the start, you know.
And I think that was a really defining thing of the show, because in this era when you guys were doing it, I was just a baby journalist starting out, and it was such
thanks for making that point, Lee. Right.
It was such a good show. And I remember, you know, if I'd get in the lift and one of you would be in, I'd think, oh, it's Kerry O'Brien, you know, it's Maxine McHugh. But the thing that I think made that show so amazing in that era, and I sort of mourned a bit when they changed format away from the one-issue show, because I thought it just worked so well. It was the fact that the show always went for the top-level talent that you could get. They weren't looking for just some commentator. They were looking for the type of people you just described, which were absolute players. And so if you were watching Lateline, you know, any night, you'd be guaranteed that you'd be getting people who were either players or they had been players until very recently and had then stepped aside. And I think that that culture carried right through Lateline, that you weren't looking for sort of B-grade people just, you know, banging on with their opinions. You were looking for the best people that you could get your hands on around the world.
That's just a given, Lee. I mean, that's a given. That's what you do.
The battle for perestroika is being fought out behind these Kremlin walls in the President's office and the Supreme Soviet.
How long do you think it will take before Mr. Gorbachev does go?
Ну, это все зависит в первую очередь от Горбачева. То событие это ожидает нас в ближайшие пару месяцев.
А я мог бы его очень просто, ну, самое большее направить в Австралию послом, а то какую-нибудь Гвинею-Бисау. И вот он бы там сидел на другом континенте, и так бы, и все забыли о Ельцине. Я считал, что это неприемлемо было бы для меня, человека, которому стал на реформы, на демократизацию страны, партии, так обращаться со своим коллегой, партнером.
And yet, there are many who would say that it was Yeltsin's courage that saved you in that August coup.
Здесь он проявил мужество. Больше того, я думаю, что меньше всего он думал о Горбачеве, а думал о себе.
Maxine, I wanted to get to one of your most memorable moments on the program in those early years, and that was, of course, when you interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi when she was under house arrest. How on earth did you manage that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't a case of sort of turning up one morning for the morning conference and say, hey, let's go to Burma tonight. You know, that was weeks in the planning, if not a bit more, actually, in the execution. This was at a time, I think the interview was about 96, 97, and Aung San Suu Kyi had been under house arrest since 1990. She had come to incredible prominence during the 89 riots, got the Nobel Peace Prize in 91. So by this stage, she's attracting huge international attention. There's immense sympathy for her because her family's in England. She's afraid to leave the country because she doesn't think that the regime will allow her back. And she's got that beautiful, sort of almost angelic, delicate demeanour, that beautiful voice. What we couldn't do, obviously, is organise a satellite, a live satellite out of there. We got a crew to her residence, and I'm pretty sure, actually, the tape was flown out, let's say, to Singapore or something like that. And that had to do with kind of not contaminating the material, but I'm sure the Burmese officials would have been all over. She was watched at every moment, so I don't think there was... She would have been very careful, in a sense, about what she said, but she was certainly making her case for democracy in Burma, Myanmar.
We look around the region in recent history. In the Philippines, it took something like a very frustrated middle class that was fed up with corruption, and in the end, of course, the Marcos regime collapsed. Can you see something similar happening in Burma? Do those sort of preconditions exist?
Well, Burma is not the Philippines, but I think one can say that there is a lot of frustration building up in this country. And whenever frustration builds up at that rate, it is never good for the future.
Can there be a peaceful transition to democracy, do you think?
I think we can bring about a peaceful transition if all of us are interested enough in bringing about one.
What about the position of the Australian government? I'm interested in your view on that. Of course, our policy says that economic sanctions would not be effective against this law, and it maintains a policy of neither encouraging nor discouraging investment in Burma. Does the neutrality of this position worry you somewhat?
Well, I think that sitting on the fence must be an extremely uncomfortable position, and I myself have never been in favor of such a very precarious stand, or I should perhaps say sit, as it were.
Now, what I recall from that time, I am pretty sure I never asked her the question I would ask her now. What is your concept of respect for religious tolerance and the wider pluralism? We now have a semblance of democracy in Myanmar. They have elections, but quite frankly, it's illiberal democracy. And we have seen the shame and the disgrace of what has happened to the Rohingya.
Lee, like me, you were a foreign correspondent before you took the chair on Lateline. You were in Washington, and in fact you went back to the United States to do an interview with Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, one of the things that I absolutely loved about Lateline, so I had been US correspondent just after 9/11, and I got back in 2006, and then I came into Lateline in 2007. The time slot for Lateline, so it was at 10:30 p.m, although it sort of wiggled around a little bit around that. It always floated a bit.
Did it ever?
It was, I know. The strength of it was that you pretty much had the international terrain to yourself, because 7:30 was too early in the evening. London had only sort of just come online. Americans were asleep still. But the 10:30 p.m. slot, it was first thing in the morning in the United States.